What theory of consciousness do you believe in? What do you subscribe to?
Well, first of all, okay, so let's step back before I answer that. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about experience, because not everyone agrees what consciousness is. To many people, particularly to functionalists, which is most people, at least most scientists and most philosophers, consciousness is a function, is one or more functions. And once you explain those functions and computers replicate those functions, that's it. That's all there is to explain. I'm of the opinion that consciousness may relate to functions, like right now, but when I dream, when I'm just sitting there meditating, when I'm taking a psychedelic drug, I can have profound changes in my phenomenology, in the way I experience myself or the world, yet there's no function associated with it. So for me, consciousness is any experience. Boredom, angry, being in love, seeing red, those are four different experiences. All right. Then with respect to theory, so it's not a question of what do I believe. Well, actually, I do believe a few things. I do believe that consciousness is a central most aspect of my existence and all of our existence. The only way, I mean, hundreds of people have said this before me, but I'm just emphasizing it. The only way I know that I exist, shades of René Descartes, is because I experience. I have a pain, I have pleasure, I see. Otherwise, I wouldn't even know that I exist. And so any theory, any scientific theory of matter and energy in space and time also has to deal and has to try to explain what consciousness is. So that's what I do believe. I also believe that you don't need a consciousness of self. Many theories emphasize, they sort of reify and put on a throne the ego, the self. But we all know, you can experience loss of self, whether that's during flow or during meditative states or during mystical states, near-death experience, psychedelic states. You can lose yourself completely, including your sense of body, your experiential self, your memory, yet there is still something that has an experience. So those are some of the basic facts that any theory worth its salt has to explain.
Yeah. Give someone, because I think research into consciousness is a bit of a black box for even people in the scientific field. It's incredibly hard to even know what consciousness research actually involves. So what research have you been doing? What does consciousness research really involve? What questions are you really trying to tackle in the lab on a daily basis?
Well, so for instance, some are immensely practical. If one of us walks outside the door, gets hit by a truck, okay? Or you have a cardiac arrest, or you have a stroke. You go into the ICU, right? Your body is put in the ICU. You're put on a ventilator, so you're clearly alive. Your brain EG, your brain waves show some irregular EG, but they ask you, sir, can you hear me? Can you track my finger? Can you track the light? Can you say something? Can you move your head? And you can't. And this state persists for 2 days, for 3 days, for 4 days, for 5 days. This is called disorder of consciousness, and you're called now behavioral unresponsive. So the question is there someone there? Because we know through various reasons that 10 to 20% of the time there is someone there, although due to the injury and their location, you're unable to signal that, okay? So this is an immense practical problem, partly because, at least in the US, it's a little bit less aggressive in Europe, but in the US, 4 to 5 days after this trauma, this accident happened to you, the doctor will initiate discussions with the family about withdrawal of life-critical support, okay, 4 or 5 days. And in fact, 80% of these patients die because the ventilator plug is pulled. In the absence of clear diagnostic knowledge, is this person actually present? So that's one, I agree with you. Many people think conscience is very, very esoteric, but this is where the rubber hits the road. It's a very tough decision that you, as family member, are now being called upon. In the absence of knowing whether your loved one is conscious, do you agree to discontinue life support? Okay. Now, what sort of research? So that's clinical research. Sort of more experimental research is, for example, I put you in a magnetic scanner. So I can track your brain activity and I show you, let's say, a visual illusion where sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. The physical stimulus is always present, but sometimes you clearly can consciously see it and can speak about it, and other times you don't. So now I can track where, when you see it, what region is active, which part of the brain is active, compared to when you not see it, but in both cases the input is always there. That's, for example, one classical set of experiment. And you can do the same for not only vision but also hearing, for somatosensory. You can show stimuli that they're so brief, so faint that sometimes they're there, sometimes you perceive them, and sometimes you don't consciously perceive them. So again, you can track the differences. So that's a popular technique. You can get people into altered states of consciousness, like psychedelics, and you can show, you can put EG on them, you can put them inside magnetic scanner and see where's the difference between them. By the way, you can do all these experiments, and they are done both in people where you can directly talk to them about it, but as well as in monkeys, or these days very popular in rodents, mice and rats, where you can't directly talk to them, you have to infer that they see something because they do an appropriate behavior.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I've heard the case from some scientists where consciousness is such an esoteric topic that it's probably not gotten as much funding as more concrete topics, but I can't think of a better field to research than the reasoning you gave at the start, where if somebody is on a life support machine, truly understanding the sort of position that they're in, I think that makes a very good case for why we need to continue studying this and why we need to keep asking questions. One of the questions that I've always been very curious about is where the boundary is in consciousness. I think we can all agree that some animals are conscious, and then I think there's some organisms that we can all agree, or maybe some of us can't agree, that aren't consciousness. So I guess my question is, what do you think is the most advanced organism that isn't conscious? And I'm curious to think why it isn't conscious.
It's very difficult to say. How do I know that you're conscious? Okay. Now, logically, we all know this. I cannot prove that no one is conscious and only me. Right? This is called solipsism. It's logically perfectly plausible. It just shows you that logic doesn't help you very much when dealing with the real world. It's extremely likely that you're conscious. Why? Well, because otherwise I would need to postulate one set of brain facts for my brain, that my brain somehow magically gives rise to consciousness, but somehow the laws of physics are different in your brain, and although your brain is very, very similar to my brain, somehow you aren't conscious. That's extremely unlikely. So it's an inference. It's always an inference to the best, to our best explanation. Now, what about a baby? Or what about a person who had a stroke, right? So that person can talk. The baby cannot speak yet. So again, I have to use inference that given all the best evidence, given their brain, given their behavior, they're probably conscious. Now, what about a cat or a dog? Again, if you live with a cat, do you live with a companion animal?
Not at the moment, but I've lived with a dog most of my life.
Okay, and what are your feelings about consciousness in dogs?
I would say that dogs are conscious, yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so again, how do you know? Well, the brain is, if I give you a little bit brain of dog brain or monkey brain or human brain or elephant brain or whale brain, it all looks to first order very similar. And if I remove the scale bar that tells you how big it is, it's almost impossible to tell. Even an expert armed with a microscope will have difficulty telling, a little bit of a quinoa grain from a dog, to tell that apart from a cat, from a human. The basic hardware is the same. Our brain is bigger than the dog brain, but of course there are blue whales and elephants who even have bigger brain than ours. Okay, so most people have no trouble assuming mammals are conscious. Now, what about an octopus? We've all seen these wonderful movies in octopus. They seem very clever. They have a very advanced nervous system. It's different from ours, but it's very advanced. And so most people that study them would assume they're also conscious. But again, it's an inference. And the challenge is the farther you move away from Homo sapiens sapiens, from adult Homo sapiens, the more difficult this inference is. So what about a bee? So I used to study bee. Okay, so we study mice. Okay, this is the brain of a mouse.
Amazing.
It's roughly 1,000 times smaller than ours, but it's again very similar to ours. Its behavior is not the same. Of course, it doesn't talk, etc. But it's very similar. So most people assume that a mouse feels like something. What about a bee? The brain of a bee is roughly 100,000 times smaller than ours, but its circuit density is actually 10 times bigger. It's much more densely packed. The neurons are vastly complex. It has complex behavior. It can identify individuals. It has a waggle dance. So again, most people now who study these matters assume that it also feels like something. It doesn't have a voice in its head, like in some cartoon movies, but that if it goes, in the sun, it has put up, it went a deep dive onto the nectar of a flower and it flies back to its mates back in the hive. It may too feel happiness because it has similar hormones to the hormones that we have. So where does this end, this border? That's very difficult to say at the current state of affairs. It may well be. So one position is biopsychism, the position that everything on the tree of life is conscious to a smaller or to a larger extent. That doesn't mean, again, it thinks about the weekend, it can project itself forward into the future, or it can remember things in the past. That's sort of more associated with higher animals and people. But it may well be, and that's a position I have, that everyone on the tree of life is sentient to larger or smaller extent. But that's difficult right now to make. That case is difficult to make right now scientifically.
Of course. I ask because I think if anyone has a sharp intuition on that sort of thing, it would be you. So I'm always curious in getting the perspective. So if you think the entire tree of life has some degree of consciousness, some degree of experience, they have some experience of what it is to be themselves.
Yes.
You would bring that all the way down to the C. elegans worm, bacteria.
Look, a single bacteria contains about 10 billion 10 billion proteins of probably 2,000 different types. Vast complexity. No one has ever tried to model. I mean, people have tried, but no one has ever completely modeled it. Yes, it too may in the limit feel a little bit like something, and once its walls dissolve and it dies, then it doesn't feel like anything anymore. In fact, I'm sympathetic to the point of view that everything or many things, many more things are in minded, have some sort of simple mind that we conventionally, that maybe even some non-evolved physical system may feel like something. But that takes us far away right now from what the scientific evidence shows either way, either for or against. We simply don't know. Our intuition is that we are conscious and closely associated creatures are conscious.
Yeah. I'm curious, has your study into consciousness and your knowledge and deep research into the topic changed how you live your life on a daily basis? Do you meditate? Do you try to activate altered states of consciousness? In general, how do you live your life with all of the knowledge that you have about consciousness?
First and foremost, I don't eat the flesh of other creatures anymore. So I
Okay.
turned
That's interesting. I was going to ask that question. Do you gain an increased sense of morality and ethics towards other organisms?
an increased sense of respect. I don't eat, since triggered by the death of my beloved German Shepherd, Nosy, that night 20 years ago, I promised her I would never eat the flesh of another, certainly of another vertebrate again. And I really haven't since then. Yeah, so, trying to stay true to now moving to a vegan, just to minimize the suffering of all creatures, particularly the industrial husbandry of animals, which is really a crime of monstrous proportion. So that's a very concrete impact on the way I and my family lives. Yeah, more recently, since I'm a student of consciousness, more recently I've encountered over the last few years other ways of powerfully modifying consciousness, including psychedelics, as well as certain religious tradition that like ayahuasca churches or other ways of accessing altered states of consciousness for several reasons. If you can do, they under these various influences, your conscious experience of yourself and or of the world can profoundly change. So you can use that to study the basis of that in the brain, but also you can ask whether some of these altered states of consciousness can teach you something about the ontology of the world, what truly exists. We all grow up, certainly as scientists in the modern Western world, as physicalists, right? That we believe everything is at least physical, and then consciousness comes on top of that. But of course, that's problematic, since so far philosophy has been unable to explain how consciousness arises out of the physical. And then so I'm a physicist, if you talk with fundamental physicists, we have a great difficulty to explain the meaning and what really is a physical, to the extent that we've given out Nobel Prizes for weird findings like, well, two particles that are entangled, they can be, on the opposite side of the planets. We don't know they're in a superposition of states, and they depend on me, the observer. When I look at them, they then, acquire a definite state, so that means they are observer dependent. And furthermore, they're instantaneous coupled across vast distances. As soon as one of these states goes, the waveform collapses as the standard language, then instantaneously the state of the other bell pair is also entangled. So that's really very, very different from sort of the traditional picture of, atoms in the void that sort of is associated with physicalism, aka materialism. Maybe physicalism has got it backwards. Maybe what truly exists is the mental, the phenomenal, and everything arises out of the phenomenal. This is an ancient philosophy known as idealism, right? That what's truly fundamental is mental state, consciousness state, and out of that arises the world. So that's a very different metaphysics that a lot of people are now reconsidering.
Would you mind taking one step back and giving an overview on what physicalism is? What does that ideology entail?
Yeah, so it's a metaphysical assumption. So it's not a scientific assumption. It's a metaphysical assumption. It comes, before and independent of science. So you can be an idealist and be a scientist. You can be a physicalist and be a scientist. So physical. So there are two poles around which Western philosophy has sort of oriented itself: the physical and the mental. So the physical is things like this, atoms. We think of little spheres that interact. A very old idea, goes back all the way to Democritus. And he famously said what exists is atoms and the void. There's nothing else, okay? So ultimately, and this was known for the longest as materialism. And as modern physics showed that, the energy is identical, energy and matter can be freely exchanged, Einstein. And then you have dark matter and dark energy, so now it's called physicalism. So in other words, there is some substrate that's independent of any mentation, of any mental entity that exists for itself and evolves, following its own inherent laws of nature. All right, so that's physicalism. And so if you want to explain consciousness, the challenge is to explain these feelings, the feeling of pain or pleasure of being bored, as arising out of, molecules and atoms. And that has been the challenge. I mean, it's clear that there are very close association between the physical and the mental. So, for instance, we know that if you hit me hard enough on the head, not on my heart, I lose consciousness. We know that if you put an electrode into certain parts of my brain, it'll affect my consciousness in a very predictable way. So we know that these very close association between physical states and mental states. But how do physical states give rise to consciousness? That's always been the problem. And so some way of responding it, Dan Dennett, for example, most famously here in America, says, well, you're confused. There really isn't anything to explain. Consciousness isn't anything above and beyond just behavior. All there is just atoms and behavior. Functionalism. So this is what's known as Turing functionalism, computational functionalism, or just as functionalism. So all there is behavior. You have the laws of physics that give rise to motion, and that's it. There's nothing else to explain. And therefore, if you build machines like large language models that have the same behavior as conscious people, ergo they are also conscious, no question about it. But the challenge has always to explain in a satisfactory manner, well, how do these feelings arise? And so on the other hand is sort of classical dualism. So you grew up in Ireland, classical, at least used to be very Catholic. So you have Cartesian dualism. Well, there are two things. There's the physical, that includes the brain, and then there's the mental, the spiritual, used to be known, the soul, consciousness. Are very different ways of conceiving of it, right? There, the problem in classical dualism is always been, well, how does the mental and the physical interact, right? If it's really ephemeral, how does that, what is the link there? Besides a certain thing, there is some sort of link. We know this empirically. Well, how does it actually happen? And then idealism says, well, forget about the physical. What really exists is only the mental. And then there's another broad idea called panpsychism, which says at the bottom, everything has both aspects, has external, third-person aspects that we know as a physical, but also it feels like something from the inside. It has internal aspects. It has mental. And so even the constituency of matters, elementary particles, they have already an itsy-bitsy little bit of feeling, of consciousness from the inside. So if you were an elementary particle like an electron, you would maybe feel an itsy bit like something. Not like a lot, everyone admits, but a little bit. And then it has, of course, external properties like charge and, that you can measure using physics. And so you have a great aggregation of them, a brain, and then, you get a lot of consciousness. The brain is just, consciousness is just how a brain feels from the inside. So those are sort of broad panpsychism, dualism, materialism, aka physicalism, idealism, panpsychism, those sort of the broad construed philosophical fields.
And am I right in that's a great overview, and thank you for going over the terms, because I know it's just it can be hard to even have these conversations with just so many terms, and I'll put them all up on the screen as well. Am I right in saying that the very elementary definition of panpsychism that you gave, which is on a very subatomic level, that even these atoms have some tiny amount of consciousness, that there isn't actually really any concrete evidence for that direct statement?
No, but there's also no evidence against it. I have to point out. No. I mean, once again, we return to what I said earlier. The direct evidence for consciousness is only me, right? And then by inference, we assume that you have it and our cats and dogs have it. But as I said, this inference becomes very difficult to make when you're very far away from creatures like us. So this is where you need a theory. So ultimately, you need a theory that tells you, is this thing here, right? Is this conscious? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Right? Is an elementary particle conscious or not? And if so, why or why not? And there's one theory that tries to do all of that. That's known as the integrated information theory of consciousness. That I like a lot. And that I think tries to explain some of those things, and it shares some intuition with panpsychism. It's not a panpsychic theory, but it asserts that fundamentally what exists is consciousness, and consciousness has a few properties, like it exists for itself. It's definite. It feels the way it is. You have to explain that. It has particular boundaries that are certain things that are within my conscious experience, but many things that are outside of. It's integrated. It's one. Right now I have a single experience that includes this Zoom screen. And what you're saying to me, it's one. And it's also highly differentiated. It's different from any other experience I could be having right now. And so then I'm looking for a substrate that has, for anything that has these 5 properties of consciousness. And the theory sort of is very fundamental. It says what exists as only things that have causal power. And consciousness is causal power upon yourself, but only what has causal power onto itself or onto others truly exists. And so it distinguishes between absolute existence and relative existence. My consciousness exists for itself. It's absolute. It doesn't depend on anything else in the universe. It's just, it's there for itself. In deep sleep, it doesn't exist anymore. When I'm in anesthesia, it doesn't exist for itself anymore. My body still exists, but for others, right? When I'm in deep sleep, For my wife, my body still exists, but for me, nothing exists. So in that sense, consciousness has this absolute existence. While other things, bodies and trees and stars, etc., they only exist for others. They don't exist for themselves. That's the difference, according to IIT, between conscious entities, consciousness, and everything else.
Dr. Christof Koch, what an absolute legend. I really enjoyed my conversation with him, and I hope you enjoyed that clip. If you did, then I couldn't recommend more you check out our full hour-long conversation you can get right now here.